Hey team, so I wanted to show you an example of where you can use the debugger statement to understand what's happening in underlying code. So I've put together this very simple HTML page. There's not a lot going on. I'll just show you what happens. When I click load users, it's going to just load some user data and put it on the page. Okay? So I've got some code that's running this, and I'll just sort of walk through it very high level. We've got an unordered list here that is going to contain the users. And so that's where the data is going to be going. And then we've got this button here, and when we click that, that's what's going to fire the code to put the users into the document. Here I've just got some very basic styling, nothing really of importance here, but just to kind of show you what's making the page look the way it does. And then here's the script that runs the functionality, and so we'll sort of dive into this. I've added some comments, but I'll also sort of walk through parts of this as well. So right here on line 4, you can see this is just going to be our mock data. This doesn't really come from anywhere, but we can pretend like this is coming from a database or an external source that has our users. So very simple structure here. It's just an array of users, and each user is an object that has a property called name, and that property contains a string value that represents the name of the user. And here on line 15, we're just storing a reference to the unordered list of users because we're going to use that variable more than one time. So we're pulling that into a variable. And then on line 17, we've got our insert users function. This is just going to create a new list item element for our user that will contain the name of the user, and it's going to insert it into the document by appending it to the user's unordered list node. So on line 42, this event listener is just going to say when all of the HTML elements have been loaded into the document, fire this event. So this is how we can wait for things to be in the DOM. Sometimes if you're just trying to attach event listeners to elements or manipulate elements, they may not be loaded just yet. And so you may have some unexpected results. In that case, using DOM content loaded can really help you out there. So on line 44, this is where we're going to be attaching the click event to our button. And so when we click the button, this code is going to fire. And if we look a little bit more closely at this, we see a couple of things happening here. So on line 46, I'm actually storing the length of the user data array that we had at the top. And I'm storing that into a variable because we're going to use it more than once. And it's just good practice if you're using something more than one time to go ahead and put that in a variable. So we've got that here available. We'll actually use it down here in our for loop. And on line 47, I'm just going to go ahead and declare the variable that we're going to use to be the index, right? So sometimes you'll see that down here, for var I equals 0. But because JavaScript will hoist to the top of the function scope for variable declarations, I'm just going to go ahead and do that at the top. And now we've got this for loop here. And so this for loop is going to iterate over every user that we've got using total users as the guide, right? And every time we loop through, we're going to go ahead and do an insert user, which is going to call our function up here, which should then put it into the document. Let's say I wanted to see exactly what a for loop does. How does this work? Well, what I can do is I can come in here and I can use the debugger statement. So I'm going to come in and put debugger here. And now that I've got the debugger statement in here, when I come back and I refresh the page, now when I click this button, something different is going to happen from the first time we did it. When I click this, you'll see that the JavaScript console actually pauses on our debugger statement. Now I've got some things over here on the right that I can do. Now I'm not going to go into these too in depth in this video. That will be for another video. But just to kind of talk about the two that we'll really be using today is the step over and the step into. Now they both will move forward one step. However, the difference is that if you get to a function, like when we get down to line 53 here, if I were to do step over, JavaScript will execute that function, but would not put me into that function. If I were to do step into, then JavaScript would get me into that function. So I know that probably sounds a little bit confusing, and I'll show you that here in just a second. But for right now, we're just going to go ahead and do step over, and let's see what happens when our for loop starts. What's the very first thing that happens? So as you can see, I have I right now, which is undefined, and it's in this initialization statement here, and this is going to run one time, and it's going to happen before anything else in the loop happens. And so if I'm looking over here, you can see the scope chain here. If I'm looking over here on the right, I can see I is undefined. Now when I move to the next step, you'll see I gets set to 0. So the first thing that happens in a for loop is the initialization statement runs. So now I is 0. Now I'm in the condition statement. So the condition statement, typically what you'll see is a comparison of some sort. A very common pattern is I is less than some length of an array, and that works because arrays are 0-based. So if I equals the length of the array, we know that we're done. We know that we've gotten to the very end because the last element in the array is always the length minus 1. So very simple condition here. And what I can actually do is I can highlight this, and you'll see DevTools is going to show me this is true. I can right-click, and I can actually add it to my watches. And so now what I can do is, as I'm going through, I can very quickly see, well, what is that condition going to be, okay? And so now JavaScript is going to do the comparison. Is I less than total users? Well, if I look over here in my scope chain, I can see total users is 4. I can see that I is 0. So I can see actually the comparison that I've added to my watch. I can see that I less than total users is true, which makes sense, right? 0 is less than 4. So because this is true, now JavaScript is going to execute the block statement for the for loop. So when I'm referring to a block statement for the purpose of this video, I'm talking about everything that's between the opening curly brace at the end of line 52 and the closing curly brace on line 54. So everything in between, which in this case is just the line 53 execution of the insert user function. So we can see this comparison is true, and JavaScript goes in and now begins to execute this function. So this is where I'm going to switch over to the step into, and I'll actually show you the first time as a step over for comparison. So I do step over, it executes, it goes to the very end. This is the final expression statement. We're going to increment I, and now we're going to go back to our condition statement, which we can still see is true. So I is 1, total users is 4, 1 is less than 4. We'll come back in, and now we'll hop into it. We'll do step into, and you can see it brings me to the top of the insert user function. I can actually see what user is. I can see what the name is. So I've got user. User is truthy, so that's going to work. So short circuiting, just so that you know, with an and statement, if we're doing and the left side is falsy, then it will not evaluate the right side. If the left side is truthy, then it will give you what's on the right side. And an or statement is sort of the reverse, right? So or will short circuit if the left side is true, the right side is not evaluated. So just nice to know that you can short circuit these. Maybe I'll do a video on that sometime so you can see that in action, but that's what this is doing. So now moving on, we're just going to do some very simple error checking. I just want to make sure the username is not undefined, because if it is, then that's going to give some unexpected results a little bit further down. And I think it's always good habit to do some sort of data validation. Now you can see here, we're setting our li variable to a new list item element. We're setting the class name so that it matches what we've got in our CSS. Then we're setting the text content, which is going to put that name as a string into the node. And now we're going to append this to our list. So now when I hit this button, you're going to see that appear right here under Matthew, as it does. And now we've ended the function. So this is because we're not returning anything. This is where the implicit undefined return would happen. And we should wind up back here in our for loop, now in the final expression statement, where we will increment I by 1. And the loop continues. So this is just a very simple example of how to use the debugger statement to see what's going on under the hood. As you can see, by doing this, without even looking at the documentation, we were able to sort of dive in, put a debugger in there, and sort of examine what's going on. Now, I will use this a lot, especially if I'm coming into a code base that I didn't build. Maybe it's not documented very well, and I just kind of want to see what's going on. If I don't have access to that source code, that's okay. I'll show you exactly what you can do. Let's say I didn't have the debugger statement there, and I'll save this, come back and refresh. What you can do, very similarly, is you can open up DevTools, you can find where the code is, and there are some tricks to do that, by the way, if this is an external system and you're not exactly sure how to find it, I'll do a video on that at some point too. And you can just put a breakpoint here. So I can put a breakpoint at the very top of this function, and it's going to operate the exact same way that the debugger did. If I click this, it'll pause on that. And again, I can just step through. I can see every part of what's going on. If I wanted to step into the function, I could do that. And I could just kind of go through and see exactly what's happening. And this will allow me to assess what's happening, gather that information so that I can make an informed decision on how I want to accomplish the task that I'm looking to do. So I hope that this was helpful for you. Debugger statement breakpoints are very, very awesome. Hopefully you guys can get out there and experiment. If you have any questions, drop them below. I'm happy to respond. And I'll see you guys in the next one.